You are watching programming from the East-West Center in Washington, D.C.
Well, good morning, good day, good evening from wherever you're joining us. My name is Satu LeMay. I'm the Vice President of the East-West Center and the Director of the East-West Center in Washington. It brings me great pleasure and delight today to have with us Mr. Eric Gomez of the Cato Institute for a program on the promises and pitfalls of American INF-Range missile deployments in Asia. Many of you who are joining us today will be well aware of the debates following the decision on the INF last summer. We'll be aware of the debates about the security situation in the region, and more recently, the debates in Japan about its Aegis Ashore decision, as well as future missile capabilities. We're delighted, therefore, to have Eric Gomez to take us through some of these issues and related matters, because he is part of this special series of webinars that we're having called 60 Minutes for the 60th Anniversary. And this is a series of webinars that brings together alumni of the East-West Center from the region and from the United States. And Eric Gomez joined us in 2012 as a young professional, where he did a variety of wonderful research and projects while at the East-West Center. And now, lo and behold, these years later, he is Director of Defense and Security at the Cato Institute. So we're absolutely delighted, Eric, and thank you for taking the time to join us. It's always great to have our alumni back from, as I said, the region and from the United States in our various leadership, education, exchange, and training programs. So thank you. He also has an Asia-Pacific bulletin out on this subject, sort of to correspond with his talk today. So I hope you will avail yourselves of that. And if you're not on our list for receiving our analyses, please consider doing so. Today's program format is very simple. We're on the record. We are live on Zoom, live on YouTube stream, and Eric will present his PowerPoint for give or take 30 or so, 35 minutes, and then we'll have about 20-25 minutes for Q&A. And as I said, please use the chat and Q&A functions for those purposes as indicated in the protocol instructions. And I will read them for two reasons. One, because our live stream YouTube colleagues will not be able to see the questions that Eric is responding to. And second, it will mean that Eric doesn't have to bother looking down and organizing his responses, and I can give him time to think through his responses. So with that, let me say welcome to you all who've joined us from wherever you've joined us these days and whatever time you've joined us. Thank you for doing so. And Eric, over to you. Welcome.
Thanks, Satu, and thanks for having me. It was a great pleasure to be an intern at the East-West Center all those years ago. I think it set me up well for where I am now, and Satu's a great boss, so I'm glad to see that.
I didn't pay him to say that.
No, you didn't pay me back then either, but that's okay. So yeah, I'll start here by sharing my screen. So to give a little background on this project, it originated as I'm a member of the CSIS Project on Nuclear Issues Nuclear Scholars Initiative. And this project on INF in Asia is something that I am doing as part of that programming, but also just for some general interest because I've done a lot of work in the past on U.S. China nuclear stability, especially as it relates to missile defense. And I'm trying to expand that list of research into some of these more offensive aspects of the U.S. China relationship. So to get into it, to sort of frame, what am I researching and why do I care about this? My biggest goal is to ask, under what circumstances can intermediate range missiles contribute positively to both deterrence and strategic stability in the U.S.-China relationship? I think right now much of the focus is on the conventional deterrence aspect of the capability and what it could contribute. However, I think we have to be sensitive to some of these strategic stability things, mostly because there's not much good understanding in the United States, especially in Washington, about China's nuclear strategy, how they would react to certain movements or actions by the United States in a crisis or a conflict. And I think that the situation is more ripe for the danger of inadvertent escalation than we appreciate. And I'm going to define all of these, multi-syllable words soon. So don't worry if they're not clicking right away. I also am curious about how intermediate range missiles fit into broader U.S. goals and strategy in East Asia. Excuse me. Are they going to be part of this focus on overmatch that the National Defense Strategy and National Security Strategy have outlined? Could they be part of a different strategy? Something that folks like myself at Cato would be interested in from a restraint perspective, for example. And I think the time to start debating and talking about these questions is ripe because obviously the U.S. China relationship is in the process of deteriorating. I don't think that deterioration goes away if Trump loses the election in November. I think that a lot of the desire to compete with China is deeply ingrained within the United States, and the tactics might change under a Biden presidency, but that's it. It's just the tactics that will change. But the overall strategic picture of a more competitive U.S.-China relationship will exist for a while. I'm also looking at some of the arguments about how do INF-Range missiles fit into U.S. strategy. I was kind of dissatisfied with them, and we'll get into that later in some of the issues about target sets. But I just wasn't really, I think that there was something missing. From the arms controller side, I think that the fears of arms racing were misplaced because China already has deployed so many of these types of missile systems on its own territory. So I'm not convinced that an arms race dynamic would result from the U.S. leaving the INF Treaty, even if we were able to deploy a lot of missiles. But then on the other side of the coin, the folks who favor deploying the missiles, I think they were giving too much credit to the technology and were underplaying some of the alliance management issues and also some of the nuclear stability issues for the sake of trying to get these things fielded. And finally, I want to do this now because I think there's a window of opportunity here for shaping policy. Allies aren't busting down the doors of Washington, D.C. saying, hey, we need you to deploy these right now. And I think it's going to take a long time between the development of capabilities, the production of them, and then working out the political realities of their fielding or potentially not fielding them, where people like us in the think tank space and outside of government can have some sort of impact on how this policy plays out because it's in such an early stage. And so before I get into sort of the meat of the analysis, I just want to define a few things. So when I talk about INF range or intermediate range ballistic missiles, the INF Treaty banned all ground-based missiles with a range of 500 to 5,500 kilometers, regardless of armament. I know nuclear is in the name, but it was a ban on every type of missile that could fly between 500 and 5,500 kilometers. So when I say INF or intermediate range missiles, what I'm referring to are those missiles that would have been previously banned by that treaty. The US already has missiles that can fly to this range, launched from sea, subsurface, and air platforms. I'm not really worried about them. I'm focusing more on the ground-based forces. I also am focused more on conventional missiles because the United States has said that it will not field nuclear versions of these missiles. Secretary Esper made that pledge after the US left the treaty. And I'm going to take him at his word that the US isn't working on nuclear-armed intermediate range ground-based missiles. When I talk about strategic stability, this is a funny term because states will often label the actions of a rival as destabilizing, even if the country is taking the exact same action. A good example of this is the United States in the Nuclear Posture Review, when we say, oh, Russia has all these low-yield nuclear weapons, it's destabilizing, it's bad. And so, all right, what's the solution to this destabilizing bad policy? Well, we're going to do the same thing and field the low-yield Trident warhead and a low-yield Slickum warhead. It's like, okay, great. Similar with China and missile defense. China says that, U.S. missile defense is very destabilizing, and then it also builds its own. So strategic stability, when used in this sort of common context, is often more of a political cudgel than anything else. However, I do think this concept is useful to think about when we're analyzing the costs and benefits of potential missile deployments. So when I talk about strategic stability, I mean a stable form of deterrence where neither the United States nor China faces incentive or pressures for using weapons first, either intentionally or unintentionally or inadvertently. And so when you think about what might be destabilizing, I'm actually pretty convinced that the risk of intentional escalation between the US and China is pretty low, but I worry a lot about nuclear or inadvertent escalation, because inadvertent escalation happens when conventional military operations are taking place that the attacker doesn't mean to infringe on a targeted state's nuclear forces, but they affect them somehow anyway, either through an accidental destruction of a dual-use system or through destruction of the command and control networks that marshal nuclear forces, the conventional forces that protect them, etc. And so this is something where I think the good news is a lot of academic research by folks like Caitlin Talmadge at Georgetown University they're doing good work on trying to figure out, are there inadvertent escalation risk in the U.S. China conflict and how to reduce them? But it's something that I think is still somewhat misunderstood or not as widely understood in the policy community. And finally, to scope the analysis, INF-Range missiles are going to come into play in other regions. The U.S., like in Europe, in Korea, and the U.S. isn't going to make INF missile policy or field deployments solely based off of China. However, to keep this project at a somewhat reasonable length, I'm only interested in China and only interested in East Asia for the purposes of this. So, what might work in Asia might not work in Europe. And so I don't want you to take from this that because what I'm saying, is true about China, or maybe if you feel like I feel that it's true about China, doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be true about the US-Russia situation. And that's beyond the scope of my research, because that's a common piece of feedback I've gotten while working on this. It's like, well, but we're going to build these for, Russia too. And I said, it's like, I agree, that is going to be an important part of the story, but I'm going to only focus on China. There's also a lot of, or very little, US government information about what our capabilities are going to be or what our strategy is going to be. So by the fact of that, a lot of this that I'm going to talk about today is somewhat speculative and also focuses more on outside analysis by academics and think tanks about, what they want deployment models to be rather than what the US government has decided on, because I'm not sure they've decided on it yet. So just to keep all that in mind as we move ahead. So why does the US need this type of ground launch, long range missile capability in Asia? To illustrate with this chart or figure on the right-hand side of the screen from a RAND 2015 report, the missile threat to the United States from China has grown pretty rapidly. And you can see just in, what is this, like a 20-year time frame, the growth of, a few tens of relatively short-range ballistic missiles that could target maybe 2 US air bases in Korea, to now pretty much every US forward operating base, both air and naval, can be targeted by some form of Chinese missile capability, be it cruise or ballistic, many of them ground launched. And this is a big problem for the United States because we rely so heavily on relatively few fixed sites in order to have our military strategy and forward presence in the region. And I'm not as worried about a Chinese missile, for example, striking and sinking a US carrier while it's out and maneuvering. But if those missiles can destroy the port infrastructure facilities, the repair facilities, the fuel for the airplanes that is stored ashore, then you have a real problem on your hands in terms of military effectiveness for the United States. And trying to reduce this reliance on a few large bases that support air and naval power is a big part of the operational advantage of ground-based missiles. They give you some operational flexibility because you can take some of that firepower off of the air and naval platforms and put it onto land. They also are much more survivable because land-based systems are a lot easier to conceal. They're easier to move around. They don't present this kind of large fixed target for China to hit as much as a airbase or a naval facility does. And this also, so you give the Chinese a harder targeting problem if you can disperse your forces a bit. It also and this is an important part from the strategic stability side of the coin, reducing incentives for Chinese preemptive action. If U.S. military power in the region is if U.S. military power in the region is highly dependent on a handful of air bases or naval bases like Anderson, Kadena, and Yokohama, then China stands to gain a lot by delivering a knockout punch to these facilities very early in a conflict. Whereas if they wait until those forces can start generating and leaving the base or dispersing a bit, then they don't stand to gain as much. So they have a high preemptive strike incentive, which is not good for stability because you want that incentive to be low to prevent the conflict from heating up faster. And by having more US ground-based missiles in the region and dispersing them away from fixed sites, then the relative advantage to China of delivering that knockout punch is diminished. And so, because they can't destroy as much of the US offensive power in the region quickly, and reducing that incentive is important. So I think that by having these missiles and dispersing them, you could actually increase military restraint on China's part by reducing this preemptive strike incentive. And then finally, another often cited benefit or operational benefit of US missile deployments is that they have air and naval platform, what I call knock-on effects. So if you have more US military power that is on the ground and can be dispersed, then from a restraint perspective, you might not need to have as much forward deployed air and naval power because you can put the missions on some of those missions onto the missile systems on land. And if you are like me and like the idea of restraint as a grand strategy, this could enable you to withdraw some of those exquisite, more expensive platforms out of the threat envelope in Asia and keep them in reserve and then bring them into theater later if you need to. If you're more into, I think, US current grand strategy or into more forward-leaning strategy, the benefits of having more ground-based missiles is that you can take some of the land strike or some of the anti-ship warfare missions off of those platforms like bombers and aircraft and ships, and you can free up that payload space for other missions, be it missile defense, anti-submarine warfare, whatever you want to call it. However, there are some complicating factors, and I get into some of this in my Asia-Pacific bulletin that was published yesterday. But I think alliance dynamics and the target set debate are two of the biggest points of friction to this, pretty rosy picture of the US being able to have these missile capabilities that are so good for our position. On the alliance dynamics side, the US, if we want to deploy our own missiles on allied territory, we're going to have to secure permission from them for forward deployment. And this is fundamentally a question of alliance politics and alliance management. And to be frank, there just hasn't been much enthusiasm among US allies since the US left the treaty. Now this, maybe behind the scenes, Tokyo and Canberra and Seoul are like, oh my God, yes, we want this so bad. But publicly, there hasn't really been much enthusiasm. Shortly after, I think in the week after the US left the treaty last August, I believe it was Seoul and Canberra both said something to the effect of, we have not asked for these missiles yet, and we do not anticipate asking for them in the future. It's not, none of them are saying, we're outright saying no at this point. There's none of that going on, but neither are they saying, yes, we're going to work strongly with you to get these deployed right away or as soon as we possibly can. There's much more public trepidation from US allies about the possibility of deploying these missile systems. And this is because there's a bit of a basing catch-22. So in order to have the best operational impact, you want to have a lot of missiles that can be widely deployed and that can be survivable via mobility and concealment. So that means moving launchers out of bases, trying to get them moving around countries as much as possible. So that way it's hard to identify where they are at any given time. So they're hard to destroy before they can fire. But if you're in a friendly allied country, that might mean driving these things around populated areas. And local populations don't really like that because, of the chance that you open them up to be a target, well, that they otherwise might not have been. There's a chance that something goes wrong with the missile, it explodes, or something toxic from it leaks out into the environment and damages it. So I think that there's going to be a lot of local pushback to any kind of US deployments, which means, one way to solve that is to concentrate these missile forces at existing bases where you've already secured rights. The problem there is if you concentrate, you reduce this survivability benefit because now China knows where they are. So it's a pretty difficult sort of mix of, the political versus the military effectiveness question that I think the US is going to have to deal with when we try and deploy these ourselves. And one example that I found very illustrative in sort of demonstrating the differences between the alliance picture today is to look at the dual track decision in the Cold War. And what the dual track decision was, it was basically the political decision that got us INF in the first place. In the late 70s, Soviet Union was deploying intermediate range nuclear weapons that could threaten Europe, but not the United States. European allies were very, very worried about what this meant for the effectiveness of US security guarantees. And allies had to really push hard on the Carter administration to deploy similar ground-based US missiles. And what was important from the archival research I did on this is that allies didn't really care about the US nuclear range forces from a military utility perspective. It was much more about the signal that it sent about the alliance, and I think this helped friendly capitals resist calls from their own people to not deploy the missiles. And it helped them go ahead with their deployments, and it helped lead to the dual track decision, one track being deploying missiles, the other track being engaging the Soviets in arms control talks to eliminate them, which were ultimately successful, which is why we got the INF Treaty in the first place. So in the dual track decision, you had the strong alliance push to get missiles deployed over US objections to it because the Carter wanted to put more missiles on submarines. And I think there's just a very different picture today with China in terms of seeing it as a threat. Many US allies in Asia, I think, would like to have a more balanced relationship between the United States and China. They are willing to accept certain US security guarantees, but not go all the way and implement more aggressive policies that the US might like. Also, China doesn't present as much of a threat to allies in the region as the Soviet Union did to Europe. With the exception of Taiwan, it doesn't really present a loss of significant territory problem. Most of it is naval and air-based rather than land-based. So there's the old stopping power of water aspect. And it's a lot easier for allies to hedge against Chinese expansive military objectives on their own. Not to say that I think, China is still a lot stronger than many of them, but because it's more of a maritime domain question, there are more options available to friendly countries for hedging against that problem than there were for NATO in the Cold War. To move on to the other complicating factor of the target set debate, what US missiles will target, I think, matters a huge deal for questions of inadvertent escalation and strategic stability. Do they target targets pretty far inland in the Chinese mainland that are used to support nuclear forces? Do they target naval forces? And we're going to get into this debate in greater detail in the remaining slides. And where analysts are falling on this debate is largely a function of what they want US strategy to be in Asia. And I identify the two camps as maximizers and reformers, which I'll get into, again, greater detail in the next slide. And maximizers view these missile capabilities as being part of a military dominance strategy, a much more basically, fulfilling the goals of the national defense strategy and national security strategy, whereas reformers, which is where I would count myself, see this more as an opportunity, the missile systems as an opportunity to change how the US does military strategy in Asia in ways that are more sustainable, both from a deterrence perspective and a cost perspective. And there's no consensus viewpoint yet. I've seen, I think one think tank even, I think CSBA, I read a report by them, one that was arguing for this maximizer idea and one that was much more from the reformer idea. So even within the same organizations and institutions, there's some of this debate happening. I think this is going to be a big fundamental question of what to do. And to illustrate these differences between maximizers and reformers, maximizers see intermediate range missiles as this missing piece of an otherwise sound U.S. conventional approach to China. Conventional overmatch is seen as the desired end state. And in order to do this, they need to target deep targets and enabling capabilities. Enablers are the things that help other forces do their job better. So things like air defense networks, command and control systems, space situational awareness, and bases. So basically taking what the Chinese threat that is posed to American bases and command and control in Asia and turning it on its head and targeting the same things on China's side. The issues with this strategy is that it demands very long-range missiles to fly from launch points in either an Asian ally territory or US territory in East Asia, to fly all the way from those launch points into the center of China. And they're going to need a very high degree of variety of delivery systems. You're going to need, hypersonic glide vehicles, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles. The more the better, because the idea of this strategy is you'd want to layer strikes. So you'd want to use the more exquisite high-end capabilities to punch holes in air defense networks and to target command and control to make a Chinese response or defense of other things harder. And then you want to saturate the remaining targets with more of the cheaper but more numerous missiles. This also sees competitive strategy as a main feature of US missile deployments. And a competitive strategy is basically getting China to spend money on stuff like missile defenses that they would otherwise be spending on power projection like naval forces or air forces. The reformer side of this is much more open to alternative models for how to do deterrence against China and how to do conventional posturing. And intermediate range, and why I chose the name reformer to describe this, is that intermediate range missiles are part of an option to move the US toward a different strategic approach and not continue the current one. This one has a much more narrowly defined operational role for US missile capabilities and a shorter target set, with the target set focusing mostly on Chinese power projection, so especially their naval forces, and their coastal support infrastructure for them. So this trades, the reformer approach would trade some operational flexibility for nuclear stability. So instead of going after these deep targets that the maximizers want to destroy, many of which have some role to play in Chinese nuclear force organization and protection, this one would say, we're going to focus mostly on coastal areas, not go as deep on the strikes, and target the things that help China project their offensive power outward, while keeping some of those interior forces untouched. The competitive strategy logic is also present in some of these discussions, but it's not, it's more about, during the Cold War, there was this thing called the second offset, where the Soviet Union had, a lot of tanks and a lot of ground vehicles, and the US could never really build as many. So instead of building them tank for tank, we built precision guided anti-tank weapons. And so you could destroy, if you could have a reliable chance of destroying a large Soviet tank with the use of one or two TOW missiles or javelins, for example, then that put the Soviet Union on the bad side of the cost curve, because we could destroy their tanks for the marginal cost of building an extra missile to destroy their tanks was a lot less than them building an extra tank. And so this is that logic is also present in this reformer approach, right? Don't try to match Chinese naval capability close to China because they have the industrial capacity and they're also right there. So you're not going to be able to realistically, meet them ship for ship, but you don't have to. If you can have a cruise missile, coastal defense cruise missile battery that can prevent those ships from getting close enough to land troops on your shore. That's the idea of the reformer approach. And so I think, and this is, personal opinion time, I think the reformer approach is a bit more promising. First off, I think it's going to be a lot easier to sell to US allies. Sell not in the sense of, actually selling them weapon systems, but convince them that we should do it, because many allies are already thinking about missiles in this way. Japan has been fairly explicit about using land-based long-range cruise missiles to defend its southwestern island territories. Instead of having large naval deployments in that region, they're trying to control the sea from the land. Australia, with their recently released defense guidelines, is also moving along some similar avenues here and thinking about how they can use land-based long-range missiles for sea denial and sea control missions. It's also, the US military is also thinking about this a little bit. The Marine Corps 2030 Force Posture Assessment explicitly calls for how can we use ashore long-range missile capabilities to strike enemy naval platforms. So they're thinking in this way as well. And on the strategic stability side, I think that the reformer approach is a bit better. The maximizer approach, by targeting the enabling systems and by targeting deeper systems, you get into territory where you target the systems and capabilities that protect and marshal Chinese nuclear forces. So any attack against these forces could be seen by Beijing as efforts to eliminate their secure second strike, which would be a big problem because China has a much smaller nuclear arsenal than the United States, and they need to keep that arsenal as survivable as possible. And the reformer approach, you never really get rid of inadvertent escalation. You can only make it better or worse. And I think that the reformer approach would reduce some of the preemption incentives that China currently has, while the maximizer approach might actually increase them. So according to the maximizer approach, if you're having these fewer, longer range, more exquisite missiles, you're probably gonna have difficulty deploying them in Japan and Taiwan or elsewhere forward in Asia. So you're gonna have to put them in places like Guam or the Aleutian Islands or Hawaii. And if you only have a handful of the exquisite systems, China still has a strong incentive to target those exquisite systems early, because without those systems, the US strategy doesn't work as well. So I think that preemption incentive that I talked about earlier that currently exists with air and naval platforms or air and naval bases that the US has in Asia, it could still exist in the maximizer approach because you would have fewer of these longer range systems. The reformer deployment model sacrifices operational flexibility in order to gain in these areas of strategic stability. So by having some self-restraint and limiting the target set, you don't use the missiles for as many things, but what you're using the missiles for is still helpful for conventional deterrence, and it's more helpful from a nuclear escalation perspective. So to conclude, U.S. intermediate range missiles can contribute positively to both conventional deterrence and strategic stability with China, but the effects of these missiles are highly dependent on the target set and what role they play in U.S. military strategy. Pursuing maximum U.S. flexibility and overmatch, which is the current strategy, is very tempting, but going down this path would likely create new challenges for U.S.-China nuclear stability and face greater resistance from U.S. allies to accepting deployments on their territory. And I think that a more modest operational deployment model focused on a narrower target set would improve conventional deterrence with relatively little increase in inadvertent escalation risk. And with that, I will turn it over to Q&A.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so very much, Eric. That was really very thought-provoking, well argued, and very clear. So I really thank you for that. And questions have begun to arise in the Q&A section. So I will go immediately to those because we have about 25 minutes. I have a couple of questions in case there's time at the end, but let me go straight to the Q&A. I will read the names and the questions again for those of our colleagues who are joining us live stream on YouTube because they cannot see these being entered into the Q&A session. I'll try to group them where I can, Eric, just for ease and for time. So the first question, two questions really deal with the South Korean situation. as you guessed would come up. The first question asks, what lessons do we learn from the THAAD deployment in terms of countries? And relatedly, that's by Michael Chakim. Please forgive my pronunciation. I'll try my best. And George Dolan asks, and in the future, is there any red line China could cross which could convince South Korea to welcome U.S. missile deployment? So perhaps you could, I mean, obviously there's a difference between, defensive and.
Yeah, but I still think it's really interesting and illustrative because the THAAD case, so I've looked closely at the THAAD case for a different project a couple years ago. And what the THAAD case showed to me is, well, one, how seriously China takes missile defense as a threat to their nuclear deterrent. They were petrified about the THAAD, and not even the interceptors, although some sort of dishonest analysts were, but the radar's capability. Having a radar capability so close to northeastern China, where a lot of nuclear launch units are based, you could use that radar for early warning of the U.S. GBI Homeland Defense System, which would give you a better chance of intercepting Chinese missiles. And I think that China's reaction to it really showed that they would be willing to sacrifice a lot in order to prevent something like this from going ahead. And South Korea, remember, before this happened, South Korea and China were looking real close, looking like real good friends. President Park, the president who was later impeached, she attended the anniversary of the end of World War II celebrations in Beijing. I think she was the only head of state from a U.S. ally that was present.
That's right.
China and South Korea were going like great old friends. And then this happened. And China was willing to throw a lot of that away in order to try and pressure Seoul to not go ahead with the deployment. And I think you would see a similar thing if U.S. allies, China already said that they would take countermeasures if U.S. allies accepted American missile deployments on their territory. Now that's different from saying, like, if the U.S. wanted to offer co-development help to Japan or someone else who's working on their own missile, or sell U.S.-made equipment to ally countries. I think China would still, they wouldn't like it, but they would probably have less of a visceral reaction to it than, another country inviting a U.S. deployment onto their territory. And I mean, part of this, you can look at this in a couple ways. On the one hand, you could say, well, U.S. allies, that should make them more happy to accept the deployment because the U.S. has their back and China doesn't. But there's also not much, what incentive does an ally have to risk significant economic damage with the Chinese in order to accept, a missile deployment of something that they might be able to make themselves because they weren't bound by the treaty in the first place. So I think that, the South Korea THAAD case offers a roadmap for how China might react to this in the future, especially if someone like, I don't know, Marshall Billingsley gives an interview to a Japanese paper saying, oh yeah, we're going to deploy these missiles because of China's nuclear threat to the region, which that was a story that came out like 2 days ago. And it raised a lot of eyebrows because, wait, no, like in all of the reports I've been reading making the positive case for deploying US intermediate range missiles in Asia, none of them have made a case for, we need this to respond to China's nuclear threat to the region. They've all been about the conventional threat. So if Marshall Billingsley is saying this kind of stuff, and he's saying that we need these missiles to counter China's nuclear threat, that's pretty close to an explicit declaration of these missiles might exist to target your nuclear forces. And that would be very, like, in terms of China and how they would react to that, they're going to react strongly. They're going to probably react even more strongly than if he hadn't said that. So I think the likelihood of a strong reaction is real, and I think that's going to engender a degree of caution on allies' part in terms of moving too far too fast with the United States. In terms of a red line that might change this view, for South Korea, I don't know, because I don't think South Korea has as much beef with China than, say, Japan or Taiwan do. Or I guess China has beef with them, depending on what angle you want to structure that. So I don't know on the South Korean side what they would do. South Korea also has a pretty robust intermediate range missile development program of their own. So why would they need to accept a U.S. deployment? And this is where I think we ultimately may end up going, is that the U.S., instead of deploying our own missiles on allied territory, focuses efforts on helping co-develop allied capabilities or sell capabilities to the allies that the US can now build and test because we're out of the treaty. And then what you have is allies buying this equipment and fielding it in order to improve their own conventional deterrence against China without triggering the Chinese response of, oh, we're going to accept the high profile US deployment and risk sanctions and all other kinds of things, which I'm kind of fine with. I know it's not what I think China hawks in the US want, but yeah, I'm just not sure. And then in terms of other red lines, the China-Taiwan relationship, if it continues to keep getting worse and worse, and the United States starts thinking seriously about, do we need to adhere to the communiques anymore? Do we even consider re-recognition of Taiwan's status as an independent country? That might cause something big like that might cause a level of readjustment, but I think we're still a ways off from that becoming a reality. Yeah.
Eric, sorry, on your comment about, I had not seen or noticed the piece of Mr. Billingsley's comments. Has China responded in any formal way to those statements that you said came out a couple of days ago? Has there been any response?
I haven't seen a response yet. That doesn't mean there might have been one.
Yeah. Sure.
But yeah, it was basically a connection between, because China's nuclear forces are a threat to the region, therefore we will, pursue these deployments.
Nice.
It wasn't as explicit as saying, we will use these to target your nukes.
To target the nuclear force.
It wasn't that explicit, but there was a connection drawn from nuclear threat to why we deploy.
Right.
That hasn't really been made elsewhere, to the best of my knowledge. To my knowledge, most of the discussion has been China's conventional threat, therefore deploy these, not their nuclear one.
Let me then turn to the next question in our queue. I'm just kind of going chronologically here as they appear and trying to group them where I can. You spoke a lot about the, sort of the maximize your reformer strategy, and Aaron Rubina asked, which is more effective for U.S. missile strategy, ground launched or sea or air launched missiles? And I take it that would depend on kind of what your end goal here is and what your...
So sea and air, the advantage of sea and air is that they are fundamentally mobile, right? Like they're mobile and you can hide them a little more easily. The problem with the sea and air is that they depend on these large fixed sites for infrastructure support or logistics support. Mm-hmm. And so the worry among US planners now is that over-reliance on those few fixed large facilities means that if those facilities are denied or if they are damaged to the point of being inoperable, then your ability to use the air and naval platforms to do anything goes down. And so having more of this sort of land strike or sea strike mission ashore gives the air and naval platforms more flexibility in terms of, if I have to think of, I have 96 VLS vertical launch cells on a destroyer, I could fill those with a mix of, land attack missiles and missile interceptors and air defense. Or if the land attack mission is ashore, then that's X many more cells for the missile defense mission. And maybe you can protect those fixed sites a little longer than you could in the past. So I think that's kind of the calculus going on of like, what do I, in the salvo competition, what do I need and where do I need it? But the US, and when the US was still in the INF Treaty, members of the US military testified before Congress that, that they were going to be able to do what they needed to do without putting missiles on land. That was also because the US was still in the INF Treaty. And so I'm sure if you wanted to give a combatant commander an extra tool in the toolbox, they won't say no. But they also have to be sensitive to the treaty obligations. So now that we're not in the treaty, I think that frees up some more potential possibilities. But you're right, like, and that was a big question. In a maritime dominant arena like Asia, then, you know, one of the reasons why Chinese land-based missile strategy works so well from them is because they have all the land. They can hide stuff, they can distribute stuff. And even if the US forward deploy on Allied territory, there's just less land there, right? So it's easier to surveil in peacetime, it's easier to tell what's going on. You don't have to expend as many resources to find out where the missiles are. But, you know, for stuff on the air and in the sea, that's a lot more complicated for the Chinese to target. So I think that, you know, this was a big pushback against the argument of we need these in Asia. It's like, well, you already have all this ocean. Just hide them under the ocean, right? Build more submarines, like put them there. So I think that for that reason, there's more flexibility when we're discussing US INF deployment models in Asia than, say, Europe, where it's a very different geographic problem, and which is a problem I will not go into because I have not spent any time studying it.
Let me, on this question, just one question that come to me, you know, a lot has been written and said, and you referred to it very briefly about the Marine Corps strategy, the 2030 strategy. Can you, first, for a non-expert such as myself on these missiles and the capabilities and what they're,
Right.
It seems to me that the strategy as described, or as I understand it anyway, is much more of the targeting things at sea from land, using facilities across the region. So is that strategy integrated? I mean, what the US wants to do vis-a-vis deployments very easily integratable with the strategy of the Marine Corps? Or are they two very distinct strategies? So
it could be integratable, but I don't think it is now. So the Marine Corps strategy, yeah, you've accurately described it. And it's, I think, how the Marines envision their contribution to a great power conflict in a maritime theater, AKA East Asia. However, the Marine Corps strategy is still being done in the context of full spectrum, you know, conventional overmatch over China.
I see.
So their sort of individual service strategy is in the service of the NDS and the NSS. And so other branches, I think, like the Army, for example, I think is much more interested in those longer range hypersonic glide vehicles that can hit, you know, from much further out than what the Marines will do. And so in terms of integration, I think the military is trying to work towards that. If we ever see the naval, the Navy is supposed to be doing a similar force posture assessment to the Marine Corps, and it keeps getting delayed because they're discovering that there isn't a really realistic option to get to a 355 ship Navy, which, you know, we get lots of defense analysts for telling them there wasn't, but okay. So I think that, you know, there could be that integration. Right now, that integration is still very much geared towards the overmatch strategy. But the good news is, like, and I wrote a blog post about this for Cato when the Marine Corps 2030 force posture first came out. The good news is that if we wanted to do that reformer model and think about our military strategy and goals vis-a-vis China differently, if the Marines make progress on the 2030 force posture, they'd be in a good position to contribute to that right away, because they're doing the things that the reformer approach would say you ought to do. But it's still very much like the other branches are thinking about it differently. And I mean, you know, they keep using the China framing. I think the Army was using the China framing recently to talk about like why they want ground launched hypersonic glide vehicles. And, you know, I think for the Army that makes more sense in like a Europe situation than an Asia situation, but China's the big bogeyman right now. So if you talk about it, that's a good way to get Congress to give you the stuff you want. But that's just the cynical, you know, defense budget process watcher in me talking.
Okay. Well, we have approximately 10 minutes now, Eric, and we have 3 questions. Let me take the next one is from Robert Manning at the Atlantic Council. He asks, what Asian states are prepared to, in effect, declare China a target and make themselves a target? Is that not a key part of Seoul, Tokyo, ASEAN, Aussie decision calculus? And you did refer to this, of course. But maybe you could say a bit more about that, but particularly as it relates to the maximizer versus reformer approaches, right? Depending on if they're, as you said, consistent with things that Tokyo and Australia, for example, are thinking about anyway.
Right. So there is a degree of them already being a target by virtue of them being U.S. allies. I think it's partially a matter of, what are they targeting and where? Because if you can, so like distributing forces around a country, like if the U.S. wanted to do that, then I think that generates a lot more local backlash than if it was Japanese forces, for example. So the target being painted on the back, to a degree, that's already happening because, in any kind of military contingency, there's going to be lots of steel flying at, allied territory. Like the U.S. bases are still on allied territory, so Japan's going to necessarily be suffering hits in this scenario. But I think what it comes down to is that difference between, is it a Japanese system or is it an American one? And there's a certain, I think, political importance or meaning behind an American deployment in Japan than Japan deploying it themselves, even if it's the same missile, like even if it's the same thing from the technical standpoint, from the strategic standpoint, whatever. From the political aspect, having that U.S. deployment is what I think really paints the bigger target on the back. It paints it on the back in peacetime, because then China can say, well, this is an escalation and more U.S. like involvement in the region to contain us. Let's try and resist it harder. That's why, and China was honest about this with the South Koreans. They said, look, we have no problem with South Korean indigenous missile defense. We build as much as you want, right? Purchase stuff from the Israelis. I think they encouraged the South Koreans, like, look, if you want to buy the Green Pine radar instead of the AN-TPY-2 radar that goes along with the THAAD battery, go for it. We don't care. Don't invite the U.S. into the region, right? Like, don't invite the U.S. system in. And so that, I think, is something that really gets China pissed off. And if allies want to avoid that, then it probably makes more sense for them to develop and deploy their own sort of missile systems rather than accept a U.S. deployment in region.
Eric, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I beg your pardon. I didn't mean to interrupt at all. I just wanted to clarify something. You had referred to this earlier, and again, as a non-expert, I just want to know, are our allies such as South Korea, Japan, Australia able to develop, deploy, manage these missiles on their own? I mean, it's not a question of requiring American, in this case, expertise or know-how, is it? It's these countries can do that themselves?
Yep.
Is that?
Some can. Like South Korea has a really good missile program, both for cruise and ballistic missiles, although they're more focused on land attack than sea attack, but it probably wouldn't be all that difficult to adjust. Japan also has an indigenously produced anti-ship cruise missile. I think where it comes down to is things like the technology on the inside to operate, say, in highly contested electronic warfare environments, right? The United States, you probably want the U.S. technical edges in terms of that sort of stuff, and also range improvements and things like that. But you're right, like they can build this stuff. Okay, it's more about, I think, U.S. intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance.
I was going to say ISR must be a real key U.S. advantage far above regional countries.
And I haven't really talked about it yet in this. I haven't talked about it in this presentation yet, but that is a huge factor. Is that if you can't see what you're shooting at, then these things aren't very useful.
Right.
And some of the missiles have onboard. Have degrees of onboard seeker and connectivity that they can do themselves. But for a lot of these, you will need that supporting ISR. And maybe that's where the US comes in, right? the U.S., if it offers, hey, like, we won't deploy our own, U.S. armed and controlled missiles on your territory, but here, I will sell you the same missile I use and then plug you into my ISR networks. That's a lot. You still get an effectiveness increase and you still get that improvement to conventional deterrence, but in a way that probably doesn't piss off the Chinese as much, because a lot of that sort of, ISR connectivity, we're already working on that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, thank you so much. I really do want to we have three very interesting questions, at least from my perspective. I don't know about yours, but let me take them because we have 4 minutes. So 3 questions, 4 minutes, but I do want to get them in. Drake Long asks, there's been talk about putting missiles on the southernmost islands of Japan. Do Japan and South Korea have enough depth to provide the concealment and maneuverability for land-based INF-Range missile systems necessary to keep them alive and useful? Drake is from Radio Free Asia. So that's question number 1. Sorry, I'm going to give them to you all so that you'll have time, because as I said, we have just a few minutes. Second, Masako Ikigami asks, INF in Asia is nuclear capable, I suppose, question mark. In this case, how about the possibility of nuclear sharing with US core allies, as is the case with NATO European allies? That's the second question. And the final one is, that we have time for, is, does China still practice a clear distinction between PLA, CMC, Central Military Command and Control for nuclear forces versus conventional, that could justify the separation between deep targets and more narrow targets? So I know that's a lot to lay on you, but I know you're fully capable. So I'll give you the last 5 minutes before I bring the session to a close.
So on the question of concealability, I think South Korea, yes. Japan, a little bit more difficult. South Korea, yes, because of the terrain, very mountainous. You could get into things like storing some things underground, like the North Koreans do, to help with hardening them. So for South Korea, I think they have more of that concealability under control. For Japan, on the Southwest islands are pretty small. I was actually like going on Google Earth the other day when I was bored and just trying to see if I could find the missile garrison. And I was. It took a bit of searching, but I think I was able to find it. So that is a little harder. But this is where the U.S. might come in, because if you can say, all right, I will put, if putting them on those islands is a little more difficult because of their size and they don't get that kind of concealability advantage, maybe there's an answer in stationing like shorter range missiles on the islands closer to the Senkakus and then putting longer range missiles on the islands further away. So that way you still have the same sort of envelope for covering the territory that you want to protect. And then you can deliver it in multiple different ways. And you're not only dependent on sort of one form. And that's something where maybe the US could help, because we're pretty good at making the longer range stuff that goes from the air and sea platforms, because we haven't been able to field stuff on land. And we might be able to either sell that technology or share it. The second question on INF nuclear capable.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think U.S. missile deployments will be nuclear capable. I know, I've been tossing around INF-Range in the discussion a lot. Mark Esper has said that these new missiles that the U.S. builds to intermediate range will not be nuclear armed, and I'm going to believe him. I'm going to take him at his word on that for now until I see differently in the budget request. But it's much more about the conventional strike. Now, if the U.S. decides to do something that's dual capable, this will obviously complicate the discussion a lot. So I'm a bit concerned about if we were to go down that road in the future, but for the time being, it doesn't seem like the U.S. is going to do that. And then finally on
BLA conventional versus nuclear, yeah.
Right. So I think the answer is that there's enough disentanglement from the nuclear and conventional forces in the PLA rocket force that yes, for the time being. This might be changing with the introduction of the DF-26 intermediate range ballistic missile. Previously, for the DF-21, nuclear and conventional variants were kept, as far as I know, at separate bases. So you could sort of identify which garrison you were looking at and make a judgment call on if they had, which variant of the missile they had. For DF-26, this might be changing. They might be doing conventional and nuclear at the same base. They might be doing, so based off of what the physical characteristic of the missile is, it might be possible to hot swap a warhead. So just like pop off the warhead segment, detach a conventional one, insert a nuclear one. I know that David Logan at Princeton has been doing some work on this, trying to figure out what is that degree of entanglement between China's conventional and nuclear missile forces. And I think his conclusion is basically like entanglement is going up, but it might not be going up as part of a intentional strategy to just like do it on purpose and have deterrence by ambiguity. It might be just part of it's a lot easier and cheaper to do, right? There's cost and effectiveness reasons to not separate them as much. The problem for that is if the US is doing those deep strikes and that degree of entanglement is going up for the reasons of just greater effectiveness and not for deterrent strategy, then there's a risk there of like us destroying those systems could have the like unintentional consequences. Because I think the assumption is that the US thinks that China is doing it intentionally, but the Chinese might not be doing it intentionally. And that gap in our understanding of why this is happening, in that gap comes the room for inadvertent escalation. So my answer to that is avoid that entirely and focus the US missile forces and missile strategy, the ground-based missile strategy in East Asia, on Chinese naval forces and more of those like sort of coastal facilities, which are geographically very separate from most of China's nuclear forces, which are further into the interior of the country.
Well, that does bring us 3 minutes over, but well worth it. And I thank you, Eric, for responding to all of those comments. I thank all the participants for their comments, questions, interventions. I think that was terrific. We have a number of programs before I formally close today's program by thanking Eric and all of you for joining. Let me just flag a couple things coming up in our series. One is on August 24th, that's next week, Transforming the U.S.-Philippine Alliance with Dr. Renato Cruz de Castro, who was an East West Center Fulbright Fellow from the Philippines, and former U.S. Ambassador to Philippines, Thomas Hubbard, will be joining us for a discussion of the U.S.-Philippine relationship, which, as you know, has been in the news a lot with the VFA, Visiting Forces Agreement, et cetera. And on August 25th, just the day after, from 11 to 12, we have Dr. Peter Petrie and Dr. Michael Plummer, both leading trade experts and trade economists on Is America Losing East Asia? Economic Stakes of Asia-Pacific Cooperation Post-COVID-19. So that looks at an economic perspective of what's going on in the region. And then finally, on August 27th, another one of our alumni, in this case from the American Jewish Committee's Asia-Pacific Institute joint program with us here at the East West Center in Washington. We have Dr. Yoram Evron, who is a professor at the University of Haifa, a China specialist, and he looks at the China-US-Israel triangle. Very interesting kind of approach that we don't necessarily take here in the US on the Indo-Pacific, US-Indo-Pacific relations, but how important the US-China relationship and its trajectory is for our close relationship with Israel. So those are upcoming August programs. We also have several programs coming up in September. I think Sarah Wong, our seminar and events coordinator, has put the link where you can see upcoming programs and RSVP. So again, I want to thank Eric. It's just a delight to have you, given your expertise there at the Cato Institute, but also importantly, as an alumnus of the East West Center. We thank you for taking the time to do this. And we thank all of you for joining us from wherever you are. Have a good day. Please stay healthy. And again, thank you so much. Good day.
Thank you, Satu, and thank you all for coming.